So let's start. It's 12:30. Please take a seat in the front. There are some seats still available. Welcome to you all at the Geneva Graduate Institute for these regular lunch briefings on points of the news. My name is Annyssa Bellal. I'm the executive director of the Geneva Peacebuilding platform, and it's always a great pleasure to moderate these discussions. On my left, I have Professor Cyrus Schayegh, who is a professor and head of the Department of International History and Politics here at the Graduate Institute. And on my right, I have Professor Christiana Parreira, who is also a professor at the same department. And they are going to walk us through this difficult and complex context, which is the conflict and the aftermath of the conflict in Syria. They are going to each speak about 10 to 15 minutes. So Cyrus is going to walk us through the history of the conflict and the broad geopolitical context. And Christiana, you're going to talk about the internal context and the current questions that are arising out of this conflict, or context rather. So please, Cyrus, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I think I should take a microphone as well. Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to see so many faces here. This is definitely a very important topic, and I'm very happy to do this again with you, Christiana. It's great. And with you, Annyssa, as well. Thank you so much. I want to talk about, I want to structure my quick reflection into three parts. Part one concerns, for want of a better word, geography. Okay, so just to take us a quick step back and say three things that, broadly speaking, could be called geographical. Syria is a quite particular country. All countries are particular, but I think Syria is perhaps a bit more particular than others, definitely when we look at it from the sort of viewpoint we are talking about today. For one thing, definitely in the Middle East and North Africa, it is neither a really big country nor a really small one. Really big countries with lots of power, that is, would include today Israel, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, perhaps still Egypt, I don't know. Certainly these 4 or 5, maybe Algeria as well, but certainly sort of these 4 or 5 that I just mentioned. Then we have really small countries that are really quite, weak and really can't do that much, on their own. Bahrain would be, one of them. Kuwait has a lot of wealth, but it can't do too much. Lebanon definitely stands to, reason. Syria is somewhere in the middle. It's neither quite this, nor is it, quite that. And that, I think, has effects on what it can do politically and what can be done to it politically as well. The second geographical bit that I will talk about concerns its position. It's really central. Well, from any perspective, any country is quite central. That's true. But Syria, I think, in really important ways is. Let me say why. It is either a neighbor of or very close to basically almost any of the aforementioned really large countries that I just mentioned, right? So it borders Israel, it borders Turkey, it is quite close to Iran, and it is quite close to Saudi Arabia, right? So it's right in the middle there, right? Of all these powers that have been called middle powers. That's sort of a political science term for countries that are neither too small to make a difference in the region, but are maybe not quite big enough to basically help really shape at the top level global affairs, right? So there are a good number of middle powers in the Middle East. I mentioned Israel, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, maybe the UAE, and somewhere in between all of them is Syria. Thirdly, and lastly, and still sticking to my geographical little intro spiel here, there are people in groups, ethnic religious groups in Syria that connected to basically almost all the bigger players around. So there are Kurds, right? who, of course, also live in Iraq and also live in Iran, and also, most importantly, right now, definitely live in Turkey. There are lots of Sunnis, actually the big majority, right? There are Druze that are somewhere around. There's a Shia minority, a very small one, but it exists. There are, of course, Christians, and still there are some people in the global West that have a particular interest in them. In other words, there are lots of both minorities, and then there is this big majority that have, maybe not quite inherently, but that have direct connections with their own communities beyond their own border. And that gives countries beyond Syria's border either the pretext or an opportunity or a good reason to try to intervene. So this is my first point, right? My second point now concerns a bit of history. It seems to me that one way of thinking about what has been happening in Syria is to say, and this is really sort of a big-term, long-term historical view, is to say that definitely the regime change was an earthquake. That just goes absolutely without saying. And there is a big break here and a big change here, right? But there is another way of looking at the last 100 years, let's say, in which what happened in December is not the most important thing. There is a way of looking at the last 100 years in which there is an exception, a long exception, but an exception that ended in 2011, that started in 1970, so around 40 years. And in that period of time, Syria was a state that basically was able to decide in a really more or less entirely sovereign way what it wanted to do. In 2011, not in 2024, in 2011, that period came to an end because at that point in time already, Syria started to need, or Syrian regime, not Syria, the Syrian regime started to be dependent on the support of others in order to be able to try to survive. Right? We know the Hezbollah, we start with Hezbollah in Iran very quickly, then the Russians, of course, these are the key actors, right? Before 1970, Syria also was not really it was a sovereign country, but it was really ultimately a bit player, and very often a player that was actually being pushed around by others in the Middle East. From the 1940s all the way to the 1960s, conceivably, the two most important powers in the Middle East were Egypt and Iraq. Saudi Arabia started to play a certain role in the 60s and 70s as well, but the two biggest ones were Egypt and Iraq, and both of them, in different ways, tried to have a hand in Syria. And those of you who know a bit Middle Eastern history will know that Syria, for a variety of reasons, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, basically pushed Egypt to accept it as part of itself between 1958 and 63. Okay, or 61. Now I'm not sure anymore. Anyway, early 60s. Okay. So until 1970, this is the most extreme case that shows you like how really not quite sovereign, Syria was, and how its elites tried to play third powers in order to survive in one way or another. And then we have the 1970 to 2011 exception, an extremely long exception, let's be clear, right? But we sort of thought of this exception as the new rule, which then came to a halt in 2011, right? And what we have now, I think, is a new chapter in this new period that actually started already in 2011, in the sense that we still have foreign countries that have a very massive interest and foothold in Syria, be it for political reasons or strategic reasons or economic reasons or all of the above, and that will for sure continue to play a very important role in what's going on in Syria. And there are lots of different examples that one could give here, right? So the perhaps most sensitive and most important one is, of course, Turkey. And the perhaps most important aspect here would be the interest that Turkey has in minimalizing the extent of any sort of Kurdish exceptional political status in Syria, vis-a-vis the fact, or against the fact, that the Kurds in Syria have some sort of power, right? This will have to follow this story will be one of the key stories to follow when we think about how Syria politically will move forward, right? But there are also other countries other than Turkey that will have, in effect, the Israelis definitely will have one in one way or another. The Saudis and other Gulfis will have one more for economic reasons. The Russians further, beyond the horizon, will have one. The Iranians still have one. So there is beyond this unbelievable and ultimately, I think, definitely very good break that happened with regime change in late 2024, and underlying this regime change, there is a continuity of a period that started in 2011 that in a certain way we could say was going back to what had happened, what had been before 1970. Syria as a country that is not fully sovereign, that is maybe not quite a play ball of others, that would be an exaggeration, but that is subject to a lot of external intervention. I think I will leave it at that. We can talk about our dear friend Donald and how his view of the world, because I think he has a view of the world, what this means also for Syria later on, and what the Russians are doing, and what the Europeans may try to do. But for right now, let me cap here and hand over to you, Christiana.
Thank you very much, Cyrus. So now, what about the internal dynamics in Syria? Christiana.
Sure. Thank you, Cyrus, for those comments, and hopefully I'll add to them. And I think I'll start where you left off and take us into more recent events in Syria and what they might mean for the future of governance there. So I'll start by talking briefly about the sort of proximate events that led to the Assad's regime's fall. And in doing so, I'll touch on the role of some key local actors, including Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, that contributed to the regime's collapse, and how these local dynamics can be understood as intersecting with the geopolitical factors that Cyrus has touched on and alluded to. Then I'll turn to discussing what the political order looks like in Syria today. Who are the main political institutions and actors currently in charge, and what are their envisioned plans for the future? And then I'll conclude by highlighting some of the main challenges, certainly not an exhaustive list by any means, that are facing Syria and this new leadership. So, of course, as most of you probably know, mass anti-regime protests began in Syria in 2011, and this soon, for a variety of reasons, transformed into an incredibly destructive and internationalized civil conflict. But I'll focus my discussion on the weeks that led up to the fall of Assad on December 8th of last year. And I'll begin by saying that the fact that a nearly 13-year-long civil war in Syria ended within a 2-week period via a lightning offensive conducted largely by one rebel organization is truly remarkable. This was a military operation conducted with quite unusual speed and efficiency, beginning on November 28th with HTS's entry into and quick recapturing of Aleppo. Over the next week, HTS and its allied anti-regime groups moved into Hama, Homs, Deir ez-Zor, Dar'a, the latter being where anti-Assad protests began in 2011. And on December 7th, anti-regime forces moved, again, very swiftly into Damascus. This was a development that was unthinkable to people closely following the country even a week prior. And the next day, the regime effectively crumbled as rebels took the capital and Assad fled the country. And this is not even a typical turn of events looking comparatively at other cases of civil war. For one thing, most civil wars, at least those since the end of the Cold War, don't end in outright military victory. This depends on what data you use, but the majority actually end in a negotiated settlement between warring parties. And this usually involves significant compromise on who shares power moving forward. And this is especially true of very long civil wars, like the one we saw in Syria. And adding to that, in civil wars where there is an outright victory by one party, governments usually win. On top of that, the speed with which this rebel victory was accomplished was fairly unusual. So how did this happen? Cyrus has touched on some geopolitical explanations for this quick collapse, international diplomatic and military support to HTS and allied groups. And I think this is important. This is an important part of the story. But I want to offer a little bit of domestic context as well, and to emphasize that the local and international as explanations are not really in competition here. They actually complement and reinforce one another. So in other words, I don't think it makes sense to think about the Assad regime's fall in sort of either-or terms. I think it likely could not have happened the way it did without both of these features. So I think there are a number of domestic level factors that contributed likely to Assad's fall. Of course, over the course of this prolonged civil war, the Syrian army was severely hollowed out due to casualties, defection, draft dodging. And due to war-induced economic crisis, soldiers' salaries were severely devalued. This led to further deterioration of morale. And the full effects of this hollowing have been visible to many for some time, but they were not really tested until the army confronted the rebel offensive first in Idlib, then in Aleppo in late November. I think another likely explanation for the sheer swiftness of this offensive is that on the other side, HTS and its allies have been preparing for the offensive that took place in November for over a year by their own accounts, and of course it probably made sense for them to not reveal that publicly. And this involved local planning, organizational capacity, which HTS has been building since its inception. And on the other hand, of course, this buildup was also allegedly aided by several international sponsors. So here again, the local and international are both sort of pieces of the puzzle. I think another question that has arisen since November is how HTS specifically became the sort of dominant opposition actor. And as those who have followed the trajectory of Syria's civil war know, this was not predetermined or easily foreseen. So between 2011 and 2017, the number of anti-regime rebel groups proliferated. At different points, this encompassed thousands of distinct entities. In fact, HTS is a direct product of this fragmentation. HTS traces its origins by many accounts to a Nusra Front, a Salafi organization that was founded in 2012 and very quickly became one of the most both radical and successful anti-Assad armed groups. And this group, over the ensuing 5 years, came to ally with, then later clash with other organizations in the Syrian Islamist milieu. And these intergroup conflicts eventually led to an internal fissure. And it was out of this internal fissure that an offshoot group that later allied with other organizations and would become HTS. And I think this context is important to note when understanding the organizational identity of HTS. But I think what's equally important to note about this organization is what it has done since coalescing into a distinct entity in 2017. And this is to engage in the building out of everyday governance institutions. This is what some have referred to as its Syrianization process. And by this, people mean, I think, to contrast these strategies with their more, let's say, ideologically radical characteristics. So in the province of Idlib, which has long been held by Syria's opposition, HTS has developed a very sophisticated civilian administration that provides a pretty broad array of governance goods. This has involved providing things like education, healthcare. This is, I would say, quite common among rebel groups in many civil war contexts. By many accounts, I think one of the most remarkable aspects of HTS's governance of Idlib has been its relative, let's say, pragmatism or adaptability in enforcing its ideological, that is a Salafi Islamist perspective via its control of the province. And here I want to paint a sort of nuanced picture of what's happening here. On the one hand, HTS has indeed functioned largely as a single-party administrative state in Idlib. It's often aggressively limited dissent. It's delimited civil society action. It's monopolized profitable economic sectors. But on the other hand, it has also had to face challenges from protest mobilization and remain, in different ways, responsive to citizen demand. Again, this is a dynamic that's not uncommon to rebel-held areas in a lot of civil war contexts. So I think this leads well into the next big issue facing Syria today, which is, after the fall of Assad, what does governance look like? What could it look like? And in this, I will refrain from prediction, but I'll talk a bit about the current state of play. So HTS is the de facto governing power in Syria today. It's already taken a number of steps to begin what it calls a political transition process. And in the short run, this has included a clear demand that all rebel organizations disarm and join the national armed forces, and accordingly a promise that HTS itself will disband. Another move has been, let's say, the public relations campaign that has been launched by HTS's leader, Ahmed Ashara, who's formerly known as Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. Ashara has made appearances in countless international Western media outlets. He's made a lot of diplomatic visits. And this is all with the clear and stated intention of assuaging fears that he is ideologically dogmatic or interested in the pursuit of authoritarian control over the country. And in this vein, he's made assurances that a democratic process will be undertaken in Syria, and that the rights specifically of Syria's non-Sunni Muslim population will be respected. And these assurances they're almost assuredly strategic, linked to a clear interest in receiving international support and funding for reconstruction, but they are also a form of hand-tying. So in other words, Ashara is making very clear, ambitious, appealing promises that he is now going to be held to in the coming months and years by both domestic and international audiences. So Ashara has also formed a transitional council. This is meant to see Syria's political process through over the next few years. He and they have announced that this transition will include the development of a new constitution, quite ambitious, and elections within a roughly 4-year time period. So this envisioned timing has received mixed reviews. It's frustrated some, but it's also not unreasonable given the sheer magnitude of what has to be accomplished. And it remains to be seen whether or how this constitutional process will come to fruition, especially given, again, to the frustration of some observers that Ashara and HTS continue to make pronouncements about the future in a somewhat unilateral way. So I'll conclude with a brief and very surely incomplete summary of the main challenges that I think Syria and the interim government face moving forward. So, of course, the reconstruction of the country's infrastructure and economy remain extremely daunting tasks. And compounding these challenges is, of course, the ongoing sanctions regime placed both on the country and on HTS specifically. So, according to some estimates, Syria's reconstruction needs exceed $250 billion. The economy has shrunk by an estimated 85% over the past decade. And in a variety of other civil war contexts, economic recovery is the make or break factor in ensuring that other political processes, incorporating armed groups into a disarmament project, democratization, holding elections, that all of these things are even viable. It's very difficult to manage any sort of political transition in a condition of economic crisis. And a second final key challenge that I'll highlight is the question of how to manage political conflict. And I deliberately use the term political rather than specifically sectarian or religious conflict. Of course, much has been made of the sort of sectarian fault lines that have been reinforced during the civil war and even under Assad's rule. But this is only one axis of conflict that's relevant to Syria today. Political control over the country has been fragmented territorially for many years, both across and within different identity-based groups. This remains the case today. To be clear, there is no monopoly on violence in Syria. HTS does not have the manpower to control the country at this point. And it also doesn't have the manpower at this point to unilaterally force the integration of militias, although that is its stated goal. So with that said, I do also want to note that plenty of other countries with legacies of authoritarianism and legacies of civil conflict and political violence have successfully, over years, over decades, navigated this type of political transition. By successfully, I don't mean perfectly, but rather I mean in somehow consistently attending to the ultimate goal of some substantially representative democratic outcome. So despite the challenges I've noted, I think the future is really quite open and unwritten for Syria for the first time in a very, very long time. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Christiana, and thank you to both of you for these very clear introductions to this discussion. Now we have a good amount of time, about 30 minutes for Q&A. We also have people watching us online, but I will start opening the floor to you first. Please, because you are so many of you, and it's great to see the room full for this discussion, please, first of all, introduce yourself and ask a clear question rather than make lengthy comments. So I saw a hand raised over there. Please, madam. The mic is going to come.
Thank you very much. I'm an alumna of this institute and a Syrian myself. I think it's very important, the issue of formation of narrative is very critical for countries that emerge from civil wars. And it is important that this narrative includes our opinions, not only one side of the narrative. And I'm afraid I didn't hear the other sides of the narrative today. First of all, HTS is not only an opposition group, it's a ISIS branch that developed into a Qaeda group, and until they came to take over Syria, we did not hear about any ideological change. The other thing is about what happened. Was it their victory, or they actually came and filled the void that emerged from the dismantling of the army itself? Because there were other groups that entered Damascus first, and then HTS came. So there are a lot of nuances that I hope in academic institutions take them into account. My question now is, given the situation in Syria and the many sectarian killings that we hear today, and revenge is happening, most of the voices that justify the current de facto authority, they give a source of legitimacy as opposition or as comparing it to the Assad. But comparing the current de facto power to the Assad is not a source of legitimacy. So what is the source of legitimacy that you see today? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christiana, would you like to answer?
I think this question of where legitimacy comes from, apart from being very relevant in Syria today, is a general question that we as social scientists struggle with constantly. And I think my short answer would be that the question of what a legitimate governance institution and elite actors looks like in Syria is being decided. It is not decided. The current government, led de facto by HTS, the characteristics of which that you pointed out are well noted. I don't disagree. They are being regarded as a transitional authority for a reason, and the point is that a variety of the key actors in Syria, including they themselves at this point, maintain that they are there to oversee a transition process that will usher in institutions that are accorded legitimacy, the plan is by elections. So the only thing I'll add is that I can't imagine a set of political elites holding power in Syria moving forward with some popular legitimacy and support that doesn't include provisions for the representation of religious minorities, that doesn't include provision for the representation of a variety of groups, including those that have fought with or still disagree with HDS's ideological mandate. I would imagine that some form of power-sharing institutions will need to be implemented. Whether that happens and the degree to which that happens to the satisfaction of a variety of societal and political groups in Syria, again, I can't make predictions, and it's still very early days.
Thank you very much. I have a question online, which is also, I think, quite interesting, from Valentina Ospina, who says that seeing this new stage for Syria throughout the years, we have seen many grave violations. Would transitional transformative justice be an option to address these? Of course, in the sense that these processes have to be tailored to the Syrian context and needs. So what about transitional justice? How to address the past violations?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think I want to separate out sort of best practices and what we think would be, great things to happen as far as institution building, and the sort of realities on the ground. And I can't speak to how these will interact, but I can say in terms of best practices, you've seen a variety of post-conflict contexts that have implemented some sort of mechanism for fruitfully addressing, not only violence and death, but also, other forms of, political grievances that have emerged in terms of the conflict. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission comes to mind. There are a variety of opinions on what constitutes best practices within the realm of something like a TRC or a transitional justice mechanism, but I think that would absolutely be an apt mechanism to put in place in Syria.
But did HTS claim that they were going to do through a process of transitional justice, or at least addressing part of the violations that have been committed either by them or by other actors in place?
At this point, the claims that they're making are fairly vague as far as what they plan to do in the future, and I think there's a very clear reason for that.
Now, a question in the room. Yes, please, sir. You have the mic already.
Thank you. Hichem Lemissi, geopolitical analyst, lecturer in international relations. I'm sorry, my English is very basic, but I try to explain my ideas. I'm very agree with the first question that we need in academics different point of view, not just the main point of view or the central agency intelligence point of view. It's very important because if we want to understand what happened exactly in Syria, we have to see all elements. Then I have just few remarks and one question. First, when we talk on the ethnical division in Syria, I'm very surprised because we are always talking on Sunni, Shiite, Alawi, etc. But they are Syrian, they consider that they are Syrian and only Syrian. And it's strange to not hearing it now. We have another country close to Syria, Israel. You have people from all Europe, all the world, from Ethiopia, from Poland, from Russia, but there is not this ethnical vision in Israel. And it's very strange to do always this difference between Western countries and countries of the South, of Global South, because the vision on the conflict in Syria and the Global South is totally different. You were talking on the question of external elements to help the Syrian state in this moment. I talk with state, not regime, because when we talk on Trump, never once say Trump's regime or Macron regime. We talk about United States of America, we talk about France, and it's important to talk with the same vocabulary. Then when we talk on Syria in 2011, Yes, the states need help of Iran, Russia, it's true. But my question is, what about the other help, jihadists from all over the world? 10,000 Chinese jihadists in Syria now. What about them? Why you are not talking about them? You know that from France, close to here, thousands of French jihadists did the jihad in Syria. Then they helped another part in the civil war, because it was a civil war. And I would like to say, always when we talk about Sunni, etc., the big majority of the Syrian army was composed by Syrian Arab Sunni, not Alawi, not Shi'i, not Christian. Syrian Arab Sunni. Why they supported still now the, as you say, regime of Bashar al-Assad? And my
Please,
last
sir, I'm so
and my
sorry.
last question
Yes,
my question is, in 2011, if the President Bashar al-Assad decided to accept the energetical policy of U.S. and Western country, what happened? The war happened or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just as a reminder, obviously you are very much knowledgeable on all these questions, but I would like to give the opportunity for other people also to ask questions. So Cyrus, please.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'll sort of try to answer by taking a look partly, backwards in time. Okay. The first thing I would say is that I entirely agree that most Syrians, perhaps all, definitely do not see themselves only or perhaps principally as being part of an ethnic or religious minority or group or even majority, right? They also see themselves as Syrians. And I actually think that the civil war has brought a lot of people closer together. It has also, however, so I entirely agree with you, right? It has also, however, created additional tensions. And these tensions need to be seen in a longer-term perspective. Specifically, I would say, it has in the minds, from what I know, of many Sunni majority Syrians, whether rightly or wrongly, associated particularly Alawis more closely with the regime. Is this right or wrong? I don't know. But I think it is very clear that this association existed in the minds of a lot of non-Alawi Syrians, right? And this is something that Alawis are now very much afraid of. I would also say more broadly, and sort of again in a longer-term historical perspective, they always were, as everywhere in the world, competing visions of what a national identity actually is all about. And one vision that was quite important to minorities basically says or implies that it is good to define yourself principally as Arab Syrian, which you can be Druze or Shi'i or Christian or whatever, but you're Arab Syrian, because in a country that is Arab Syrian principally, and this was, of course, also the name of the Syrian Arab Republic, right? Let's remember this, right? In such a country, those ethnic, basically, distinctions become less important, at the very least on the surface, which, of course, is a good thing for minorities, which is why in modern Syrian history, time and again, it was often, not always, but it was often people from religious minorities that were actually leading intellectuals in envisioning and determining what an Arab Syrian national identity actually would look like. A lot of Muslim Syrians have, of course, this identity as well. But perhaps it will take, for those who are secular, it's very clear this is all they believe in, right? But for those who are perhaps a bit less secular, there is maybe another version of this sort of national identity, right? So I don't think that what we are saying here is that we want to whitewash or simply totally from the start legitimize the new HTS regime. Far from it, right? But I think it also would be wrong to simply assume a unified Syrian national identity, given the fact that precisely so many minorities now in Syria, Alawis and Christians perhaps most importantly, but also some others, right, are really, really scared of HTS. And their fear of HTS is partly grounded in certain things that HTS did, I mean, and what it used to do in its previous sort of, manifestations, but it is also a reflection of much older fears that are typical of religious and ethnic minorities in a country like Syria, but also in other countries in Europe, you have similar situations as well, right? So I think I will leave it at that.
Thank you. Do you have a short reply? Because I know we very much welcome having all the point of view, and since you're Syrian, it's very much appreciated. We only have 1 hour, but I would like to give first the floor to one person that asked it before, and then I will, but very shortly. Please, so I saw a hand here. Yes, please.
Hello, Saif Mazdoua, second-year International Relations and Political Science student at the Graduate Institute. Dr. Parreira, you spoke at length of the lightning operation and mentioned some potential explanations like the morale and the economic crisis, but also how prepared HTS was. Some commentators speculated at the fact that some political and military elites had essentially given up on Assad and made a tacit accord with the rebels to protect themselves. I'm curious to know where you think these political and remnants of the Syrian army stand, and the role they're going to play in the transitional process and the potential for an internal struggle similar to cases we saw in the Middle East like Iraq. Thank you for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Saif. I think I hesitate to comment on this because I think a lot of this is very much sort of behind-the-scenes politicking that we do not get access to, or at least maybe some people in this room get access to, but not me. I think it's almost certain that different sort of international powers were quite influential in the swiftness with which HTS was able to conduct this offensive. I think it's worth noting that they were not particularly visibly so. And to be clear, allegedly, most accounts state that Turkey and perhaps Qatar were behind the scenes engaging in these sort of machinations. But again, they did not do so particularly publicly. And what I would imagine is that for a variety of reasons, this is the pattern that's going to continue into the transition period. Is different international powers, not just Syria and the Qataris, but also a variety of Western powers as well. Also, the different geopolitical forces that Cyrus mentioned earlier, vying for, frankly, a seat at the table, right? Vying for some sort of domestic actor that they can back and thereby have influence through. I think that process is almost certainly ongoing right now and will be ongoing into subsequent years.
Yeah, just to tie what you just said now back to the question about transitional justice, the problem which you mentioned too, of course, is that you in principle at the very least need to have some sort of stable government where everybody minimally buys into in order to have a transitional justice process that actually works at all and is possibly acceptable by people. But the current government neither is legitimate in the eyes of probably enough Syrians, nor does it have the power to actually sweep everybody away and basically just implement something. So I think this is going to be quite difficult, and this, of course, creates a vacuum in which a good number of people, because they had such horrible lives, just take justice into their own hands and start to lynch others, right? And there are lots of, stories that we hear about this.
Thank you. Please, the lady over there.
I have the microphone here, though.
Yes, but please, could you give it to the lady? Sorry. Thank you. We have to have a gender balance in the questions.
Who was it? So
Over there.
Oh. Hi, my name is Cyrus Schayegh. I'm Syrian. I work and live here in Geneva. I was actually in Damascus on the 8th of December. I was very lucky in this sense. What I wanted to mention is what you briefly touched upon is the power vacuum that was created, because on the 8th of December, and I do believe this goes back to who's responsible for all the sectarian killing and the chaos and all of these things, is the actual fact that the army and the police have disappeared overnight in Syria, and this is a very big issue. So literally what happened is the police and the army took off their uniforms and they put them on the floors and they dissolved in the community, and I've seen it firsthand. So it was quite interesting because we were very scared, because you have 30 million people on a vast piece of land. All of them are left with zero protection, no army, no police, no nothing. So I do believe that what happened in Syria was a miracle, with the fact that we didn't see killing in the street. Like literally, our neighbor could have come down and killed us and nobody would be telling them anything because there was no law. So the point is, Bashar al-Assad has refused over and over to cooperate with the UN Resolution 2254. My question being, how do you see the future of this UN resolution? Because it was based on sharing power with the Assad government, and now there is no government anymore.
Thank you very much. Cyrus, do you want to go? Or you? Yeah.
Given where the US is right now, and the fact that the UN is even less powerful than it used to be before, I honestly don't think that UN resolutions passed under an old regime are going to have much of an influence on what's going on right now. I think there are, at the very least three other aspects that we will need to follow, three aspects that sort of, interplay. One is how HTS functions itself. Will it continue to be roughly homogeneous, or will certain factions start to emerge? Are there lots of, rank and file members who do things that are not condoned, perhaps, by the top? Or does the top maybe sort of, twinkle to them and say, well, we say one thing to the international community, but look, here at home, you can still, fire that person and, kill that person? Then secondly, the question of the different communities in in Syria itself, particularly those who actually have arms to try to defend themselves, and there are big differences here. For instance, between Christians on the one side and the Druze and the Kurds on the other side, right? And last but definitely not least, all the outside actors we have talked about. So it's a really, really complicated, three-dimensional sort of game that is being played out here, right? And the actions of at each level, you have multiple players. So I think it's a crazily complicated sort of situation, and it's for that reason, as Christiana said, it's really, really, really hard to predict what's going to happen.
So the mic is going to go back to the gentleman there, and then perhaps we will take two other questions, and you can, so that two other persons have the opportunity, and then we can go back to you.
Thank you. Farzad Fallah, student here. Question for Professor Schayegh. Let's talk about the Little Kurdistan problem for a moment. I'm sure you're aware that the Kurdish representatives in Turkey have been meeting with Abdullah Öcalan. And there are speculations that he might ask for ceasefire between PKK and the Turkish government. How do you see this? Does this, in your view, have anything to do with the Syrian situation? And depending on the outcome, is it going to have any bearing on the attitude of Turkey towards Syria? Thank you.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Please, two more questions. Yes, please, sir.
Just to complete the question, in your opinion,
The mic is coming.
what is envisaged, what is planned for Kurdish autonomous identity, political identity in Syria? What is planned by big players? What is envisaged for them? We know there is a de facto autonomous authority. Thank you very much.
One more for the moment. Yes, so please to the, yes.
Yes. Hello, my name is Hafez. I'm also Syrian. I'm going to talk about the future, not the past, but I'm so happy what happened anyway. My question, in the future, if you talked about all of these players around Syria that are interested in Syria, so Syria at this moment either should be very smart and play with all of these players, or be very stupid and let all of these players play with it. So how can we be smart?
The easiest question at the end, huh? Okay. Okay, let me just start by saying a couple of things about, you know, the Kurdish dimension here, right? So one thing I would say is that, yeah, I mean, I think it totally stands to reason that these rumors, if they're true, that Öcalan is, you know, considering really declaring a ceasefire, if it indeed will hold, and if everybody in PKK, including all rank-and-file members, will abide by it, and of course the Turkish government will abide by it too, I think needs to be seen in the context of this revolution in Syria, because it definitely is a revolution, right? And the fact that Turkey has basically gained power through this revolution. So the Turkish government is certainly in a more powerful position, also vis-à-vis its own Kurds and also vis-à-vis the Kurds in Syria than it was a year ago, right? So the question then is, and I think that plays a big role in this, you know, internal domestic, you know, like Turkish-Kurdish basically context. But if I'm not mistaken, and if I remember correctly reading, I think there are also some developments that have to do with Turkey proper. Like it may have something to do with how Erdogan sees his own legacy, right? That perhaps that's sort of the direction he now thinks he would like to move to. I mean, I think nobody can look into his head, right? But I think it's probably a combination of these issues. As for the Kurdish autonomous region, right, and the U.S. backing of those Kurds in Syria, I mean, look, there is the United States as well as regional states have a long track record of promising certain Kurdish groups certain things and actually helping them out until the moment when the interest of those Kurdish groups don't align with their own interests anymore, and then they drop them. I honestly would not be surprised if the United States would at the very least downgrade the sort of support that it gives to the basically Kurdish autonomous region. I mean, I other than, you know, a bunch of oil, which is not really that important in the bigger scheme of things, I don't see what a U.S. president like Trump, what sort of interest he would have in those Kurds. I mean, Trump doesn't care about the Ukraine. Right? I mean, big picture, very big picture, he doesn't care about Ukraine. Why should he care about, I don't know, like, you know, the Kurds, one part of the Kurdish population of Syria. So if you would make me bet, I would probably bet that the United States at the very least will downgrade its support and perhaps simply pull out, right? And as for the last really easy question, I mean, the question I think really is, or let me rephrase your question, right, to me, like in my own terms. I will probably say, what sort of assets does the HTS government and people close to it actually have that can be used to tie in and balance out multiple foreign actors in a way that minimizes the way in which they actually infringe on Syrian sovereignty. There is no way, absolutely no way, that that infringement will not happen. It has already happened. It's happening. It has happened since 2011. So it will continue to happen. But the question is, what are those assets? Can new assets be created? For instance, by creating greater political cohesion within Syria, perhaps by trying to moderate even further your political stance within your organization, but that will have consequences in your organization, so you need to be very careful about this, right? Such that you look bigger and more united, and then maybe you can sort of look a little bit more like a person that can't be pushed around by all these by all these other state actors. But this is going to be very, very difficult, I think. It's also not, it will either happen or not happen. Some version of this will happen, and is already starting to happen.
I have two last questions that come from online, one from Ula and one from Bellal. Great name, by the way. Ula is asking if there is any reliable data about incidents that only targeted minorities in Syria, and perhaps this is also related to issues of justice and transitional justice. And I have a question from Bellal about, for the historian, which is, how is the development in Syria, you believe, is connected to the Yinon plan that was elaborated in the 1980s to fragment the region. So the plan advocated for fragmenting Middle Eastern state into smaller ethnically and religiously divided entities. The Yinon plan. Are you familiar with this plan? No. So.
I don't do that.
Okay, so please start.
I'm going to say that I think this is a really good question, and I don't have a firm answer to it, but I'm going to say it's a really good question, this question of reliable data. And that term reliable, I think, is doing a lot of work because, of course, for the first time, research organizations and journalists can now operate in Syria with, I'm not going to say full freedom, but some degree of freedom and flexibility. And of course, there have been, I would say at this point, a limited but not insignificant number of incidents that have been characterized as having a sort of sectarian or otherwise identity-based sort of flavor to them in terms of violence. A lot of these have been sort of local level retaliatory incidents, sort of at the intersection of a local grievance and an identity-based conflict. And I think that these should be taken and are being taken by research organizations quite seriously. And I would also say that there's a tremendous amount of fear and discussion of this on social media platforms, on et cetera, that amplifies that fear. And so I think moving forward, there needs to be accurate, reliable reporting on this, and I'm sure there will be, because there are a variety of organizations focusing on Syria, both within the country and outside, that do a great job of this.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Last word.
Yes. I don't know what the Yinon plan is. It seems to me that perhaps, this is Bellal who asked, that perhaps he is referring to an Israeli, because, it sounds sort of, I know Hebrew, but, I guess maybe that's sort of, the reference here. What I can say is that, Israel, basically in coming and going in ups and downs, has obviously, Jews being numerically a very small minority in the Middle East, Israel has historically had a track record of trying to create alliances with other minorities. So with the Kurds, with the Maronites in Lebanon, with Christian states that are close to the Middle East but not quite in it, like Ethiopia, like with the Iranians, because they are not Sunni Arab. So there a long track record of all sorts of different, a huge range of different sorts of contacts with different with different aims of different, sort of goals. And always there was a taker on the other side. So it was never just something that, happened just on the Israeli side. It was always something that in one way or another was of a certain interest to certain people on the other side as well. If anything happened in the 80s, however, on the Israeli sort of side, that was actually really quite important, or they hoped it would work, was actually not at all really dividing the Middle East, but rather in 1982, the plan to basically help a new Maronite Lebanese president from really taking over the country and aligning the country much more with Israel than what had been the case before. And that, of course, totally backfired. It just never happened, right? So I think I would simply leave this bit at that and add in 30 seconds the point that I think what one could hope might happen in Syria is that there is some sort of decentralized, maybe multiple autonomous region, or also some sort of decentralized government that will be coherent enough to be properly called a state that actually answers the wishes of all Syrians together, while still also taking into account the security and identity needs of particular minorities, right? Whether it is, what sort of autonomy that would be, whether it would be territorial or whether it would be personal or whatever it might be, I think in a country that is a little bit of a mosaic, right? Something of this sort may need to happen. But I'm sure that Syrians will probably also agree that it can't happen in a way which turns Syria in a totally weak state. Because that's, of course, the other thing that shouldn't happen. Because when that happens, everybody coming from the outside starts to intervene. So I guess the trick is sort of to have a state that is unified enough to hold its own, while being heterogeneous enough to reflect the insecurities and concerns of its different constituencies, right? And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. No, I'm really sorry we don't have much more time to discuss really this context and situation. We could spend the afternoon here. Thank you very much for your contribution, your different viewpoints and your questions. Thank you also to both of our speakers, and I wish you a good afternoon.